In this video, we'll look at three of the different tools that you can use in Capture One to enhance contrast, sharpness, and the overall presence of your images, both in isolation and as a group of adjustments. While the Clarity tool is well known as a go-to for making an image pop, I've found over the years that it's actually the combination of all three of these adjustments, so clarity, structure, and sharpening, which makes the biggest difference. I've heard people say before that they'll just stick with clarity, but that tends to be because they don't necessarily understand how each of them really function and how they can work together to deliver even better results. So let's get started from the top with what each tool actually does. Think of the three tools like layers of an onion or a Russian doll, if that helps. As we move through the layers, we're basically dealing with smaller and smaller details. Clarity is the outside layer. It's all about increasing the contrast and presence in areas of your image. It's not looking for tiny details or textures like down here in the sand. It's looking for big changes in luminosity between two areas within a scene. When it finds one, like between the sky and the sun or this ice block and the ground, it's going to make that transition between the two even bigger and bolder. So let's just put this fully up to maximum just to show you in this case. And let's look at the join between the sky and the water in this picture, or even the sky and the sun for that matter. These have both been affected by clarity. Now structure, on the other hand, is the middle ring of that onion, or the middle doll in your Russian doll set. And it's dealing with the textures and details in the area of an image and increasing the contrast and perceived sharpness in those parts. So in the case of this image, let's just put our structure all the way up. We're going to find that it affects the details and it pulls out all of that information from the surface of the ice and the black sand as parts of it reflect the sunlight. It's also great on things like animal fur, or if you want to see every single strand in a piece of fabric or whatever in your image. And then finally we move on to sharpening. Now sharpening is our central ring of that onion, or the smallest doll in our set. And sharpening delivers extra contrast and details to the lines and edges of an image. It's not looking for areas or texture down here, it's looking for the contrast lines that define an edge. And then it goes about making that line even more obvious. So in our beach example here, if I dial in a load of sharpening, you're going to find it makes that edge of the ice razor sharp. But essentially, all three tools in some way provide a perceived enhancement to detail, sharpness, and contrast, just in different ways and in different parts of your image. Now, while each tool has its own benefits, unfortunately they also have their drawbacks in their use, or specifically in their overuse, while you're editing your shots. All three unfortunately can create these things called halos, which are unwanted either dark or light ghostly shadows around the area that's being enhanced. They can easily make a photograph feel fake very quickly if you push it too hard. In this session we're going to look therefore in detail at the effect that each tool has so you can make an informed choice as to which is the best to use. So let's start with clarity, and in this case on a cityscape shot of Shanghai at night. Now this actually starts off with a relatively high contrast image in the first place. But let's use our clarity slider on the left, so it's under the exposure tab here, and you're going to find it near the bottom. You actually got to scroll down quite often to find it, and it's going to be set to natural as a method as default. We'll cover that in a second too. But let's push, for the sake of demonstration, that clarity all the way to 100. Please don't do that for real. There are a few minor cases where it's applicable, but in general, clarity is going to be used between 20 and 30, maybe even 40. It's all about moderation, and we'll cover that later on too. But for this purpose, we're going to push it up to 100, and we can see the difference it's had. And actually, wow, it's a big difference. So it's made that whole image more dynamic, more vivid, more alive, all those different words, and all with just one slider. So let's consider what the Clarity tool has actually done. Essentially, when you activate that slider by pushing it to the right, so into positive values, you're telling Capture One to assess the image at each boundary of any two areas with different levels of brightness or luminosity. It then forces the darker of the two areas to get darker still, and it forces the lighter area to brighten up even more. That's what we mean by a contrast enhancement, and that's one of the reasons why I often refer to Clarity as a mid-tone adjustment tool. It tends to have its greatest effect on the mid-tones in an image. So if you think about an image which is full of mid-grey areas and a bit of a murk in all of that, Clarity will force each section to get lighter and darker than its neighbour and deliver a contrast boost that actually pops the image as a result. It's not touched the lines or the texture in the road. Let's have a look down here. Instead, it's focused on the areas such as over here on the bridge towers, where there's a difference between the dark sky and the lighter concrete. So if I do a quick before and after, we can see before and after, it's just made everything pop. But going back to what I said earlier, you need to bear in mind that when you're doing this, there are also some downsides, and with clarity there are two in particular. First, because it's forcing areas which are darker or lighter than their neighbour to become even darker or even lighter still, you risk pushing details which are at the top of your histogram, so this information up here, off the edge of that histogram into the clipped zone, essentially overexposing them. So again, if we go to before and after, we can see that some of our highlights have now been blown out as a result of using clarity. Now, some of the clarity modes are better than others at controlling it, but it can be a real unwanted side effect in getting an image to pop using clarity alone. Secondly, because of the way that it creates that difference in contrast, it doesn't necessarily keep that difference going beyond the local area in which it found the difference between the dark and the light patch. What that means is you can end up with those things I referred to earlier called halos around the contrast point. Now, halos can be light or dark, but unfortunately they're also a telltale sign that clarity has been used, and often cases it's been overused when you start to see them. So the first thing we can do to manage those two issues is to understand the 4 different modes of clarity and what their impact is on an image. The second, and most importantly actually, is to use clarity sparingly. Use only as much as you need for that extra bit of dynamic contrast, please, no more than you really need. But back to those 4 modes, or methods as they're called in Capture One of Clarity. Now be aware that the method that you choose here, and it's just this little drop down box above clarity and structure, that method actually applies to clarity and structure. But the difference in them is easier to see with the clarity slider, so we're going to show you it here using the clarity function, but just bear in mind that whatever you dial in here as your method is also going to affect the way that structure behaves too. Now the method selector just sits up here above the clarity slider itself. Natural is going to be set as the default, but there are 3 others available. So we've got classic, neutral and punch. Now in classic, this was the original clarity setting. It was introduced years and years ago in Capture 1.6. It's actually got the mildest contrast enhancement, it's got no changes to saturation, and it's really good at preserving the highlights that we get worried about overexposing. So let's apply it. And then we see, unfortunately, the downside to classic is the result can be pretty horrendous if it's overdone. It leaves you with an image which looks obviously edited. It's got that old school sort of HDR look that's completely unnatural, along with some serious halos going on up here on these pylons. So effectively, classic was an old way of doing clarity. It's still relevant in some cases, so in daytime architecture and so on it can be useful. It's still good at protecting highlights, but it is a way of being able to see that someone's used the clarity tool pretty obviously, because it doesn't do a great job around those boundaries. Now neutral, well, neutral is actually the highest of the contrast enhancements. It pushes the shadows darker and the highlights much lighter. But in forcing those midtones further apart as well, it actually leads to a more bold, strong image at the end. The downside, of course, is that it can push a lot of the highlight detail as a result outside of our histogram, so it's overexposed and clipped, and unfortunately we lose a lot of the detail, for example out here on the bridge, by applying neutral. It doesn't affect our saturation, it's purely affecting contrast, but unfortunately neutral can push things a little bit too far. Now punch is effectively the exact same neutral setting, but with a saturation boost. So in the same way that the brightness of an area is changed to differentiate between the next darkest or the next lightest next to it, in punch mode, the color is also boosted next to its neighbor to do the same thing. So that can result in an abstract look, which if you use it sparingly can be great for night shots and cityscapes. Let's just dial it in here. But it's really, really risky to use this on natural tones or portraits or traditional landscape images. So again, let's go to before and after, and we can see that something's happened to it. It just feels a little bit too unnatural. And that brings us up to date with the latest version, which is natural. So that was introduced a couple of years ago in a few versions back. And it's actually developed as a compromise between getting the best enhancement to an image without making it look, well, unnatural, hence the name. So it's the medium setting in terms of contrast enhancement. It reduces the risk of blown highlights, but with no saturation boost and no weird colors as a result. It's also, generally speaking, the best setting to use in a negative capacity. So in other words, when we move that slider to the left of 0 and it goes into negative numbers. If you're going to smooth skin on portraits or soften the sky or water in the landscape, and we're going to cover that later on, this is the best method that you can select in Clarity to get the best out of your image. So that's the impact of the 4 settings when we're zoomed out. But let's look at some of the specific areas of that image when we compare them next to each other in each of the 4 modes or methods. So here's our towers. And obviously that classic one, we highlighted it just before, we've got these horrible halos around the tower. Now that's completely unwanted in an ideal world, and obviously the natural version gets rid of that effect. But what about neutral and punch? Well, both neutral and punch are a lot higher contrast than the other two, but they've actually blown out some of these highlights here on the hotel. We can see here, compared to down here in natural, we've lost a lot of detail on the side of that building. And punch has also lost all that detail, but for some reason it's also introduced a yellowy green tint or tinge into this image here, which completely doesn't make sense. The towers are completely neutral in colour, so unfortunately punch isn't our go-to either. In this case, natural is going to win. So what about moving to our road? Well, again, unfortunately, Classic has introduced some halos, and it's more subtle in this one, but you can see it. So you see here between this light part of the road and the dark building behind, well, we've got this darker area here, which doesn't exist on this picture or this picture or this picture, and it's because the Classic mode is unfortunately known for creating those dark halos on the contrast points. It has improved the clarity of the trees for sure, so they're a lot clearer, they're a lot more detailed, and we can see them a lot easier. But unfortunately, with that halo effect, it's just not going to be usable when we go to print. Now, neutral has increased contrast by quite a long way compared to our natural and classic versions, but we've lost some of the detail in the tree as a result because it's made them a bit too dark. And punch, once again, no surprises. It's done exactly what neutral does, but it's introduced some colour into our pylons. They're no longer grey and neutral. They're unfortunately now green and yellow by nature of using that punch method. And again, we come back to natural. So natural tends to be the best compromise between the right amount of contrast, the right amount of detail, no halos, and no change to our saturation or colour. And then finally, let's go to the over the water, the bridge part of the highlights. So these trails have become brighter, but not completely overexposed in both classic and natural. But for both neutral and punch, we've just lost so much detail as a result of pushing them too far. And for some reason, punch has once again decided to make our bridge a shade of green while it's at it. So those are our 4 modes or methods of clarity and the effect that adding positive values to the clarity slider can have. We'll come back to the negative values a little later, but for now, let's take a look at how structure affects an image instead. Remember that method selector down here also applies to your structure tool. So for the purposes of this video, we'll leave it on natural, but just keep an eye on that because your change in method will also affect the way that structure works, not just clarity. So let's switch to a different cityscape. Now, as we said with our onion layers, clarity is that outside layer and it's great for adjusting the contrast where 2 areas meet. Structure, on the other hand, is our little middle doll or middle layer of our onion. And that's ideal for bringing out the texture and detail in the smaller, more nuanced aspects of your image. So let's have a look at this shot of Shanghai. Again, it's a nighttime shot looking out over the city. And let's just zoom in here over our apartment buildings. So while adding clarity, and let's just do it, is going to make those overall buildings stand out as an area, let's say, and it's got some enhanced contrast, what it's not doing is increasing any of the detail in the window or sharpening any of the texture and all the detail that's around here in the image. The roofs and the trees and everything like that have been left alone because it's only looking for big, bold areas to effectively differentiate them from a darker or a lighter neighbour. This is where structure comes in when we want to get the details out. So adding just a small amount of structure can have quite a dramatic effect on the image. Now that also means be careful. It's very easy for an image to become over sharp. You probably know what I mean, but everyone's probably seen at some point in their life one of these images where it's such high contrast and sharpness it's actually difficult to look at. So be careful with your use of structure when it comes to enhancing detail. But in this example and for the video, we're just going to push it right up to 100. And look at the difference that that's now had on the detail in the apartment buildings and the trees and the textures below. So let's also then, in fact, let's just do a quick before and after just so you can see for sure. So there's before and there's after. And just for completeness, I'm going to reset clarity so you can see as well. So there's before with no structure, and there's after with structure. So it hasn't affected the areas, it's just gone for the details and the textures and to enhance those areas instead. Now, let's go back with that in mind to our Nampu Bridge shot. And let's look at our roadway down here. So, adding structure to this shot as well as clarity not only delivers sharper traffic trail lines, but it also enhances the texture on the concrete that makes up the road in a way that clarity just ignores. Clarity doesn't touch this stuff, it's not an interesting enough area for it. But structure is going to look at all that texture and all that detail and all those tiny little details and lines, and it's going to enhance them. Now be careful, because at high ISO, not only is structure looking at the texture that you want in an image to enhance, but it's also looking at texture that you don't want in the form of any noise that you have in the image, and it's going to enhance that too. After all, it's a texture, right? So just be aware that, again, with every single one of these tools, there are some fantastic positives, but also things to be aware of. Now, another one of those, let's just zoom into our lamppost over here as a good example, or maybe even this transition point in the bridge. I'm going to zoom in to 200% so you can see it clearly. And unfortunately here, we've introduced some halos. So if I undo, you can see here, there was no halo around here. It was a nice, clean, sharp line. But if we now reapply that change, we've got some white halos here on the lighter side and some dark halos on the darker side, and the same around the lampposts. And these are halos that you risk introducing at the contrast point specifically if you push any of these tools too far. However, if you use them moderately, structure can not only help to enhance the details of an image, it can actually also help to rescue them too. So let's go for a completely different genre of photography. And I'm going to load up this picture of a lion that I took in South Africa. It was actually shot at a shutter speed that was way too low to be handheld at 400mm. I think it was about 125th of a second. It's soft. In the same way, let's just zoom in there so you can see, in the same way that if you've got an image which is heavily diffracted, so you've got lens diffraction that can play a part if you use a very small aperture, that can cause an image to look soft. In this case, it's probably a bit of motion in the camera at the point of capture, and we've ended up losing some of the texture and detail in the lion's face. Now, while clarity absolutely does have an effect on this image, it's really not the effect that I want. I don't want to enhance the areas of contrast. I want to enhance the detail and the texture in the image and the fur. Well, of course, that's what structure is designed to do. So let's add some of this to the lion. What a difference a bit of contrast enhancement and sharpening has on an image when used in the right way. So let's just undo this. There we go before, and there we go after. We've completely rescued that image. So clarity does nothing for us here. It's all about the texture, the structure and everything. And in this case, that's what makes the difference. So what about sharpening? Well, in some ways, sharpening actually has a lot of crossover with structure, but with one very important difference. We have a lot more granular control over the sharpening tool with its 4 sliders than we do with the single slider structure function when it comes to bringing out the sharpness and contrast on the lines and edges of an image. So back to our onion analogy, the sharpening tool sits at the very center. It's dealing with the finest details where structure and clarity are too blunt in terms of their application to get it right. So the sharpening tool can be found up here. It's on the Details tab in Capture One, and you'll find it normally at the top of the scrollable area, but you may have to scroll to find it yourself in your own setup. When you bring a raw image into Capture One actually makes an initial assessment and applies what it thinks is the right amount of sharpening for that specific lens on that specific camera. In this case, it's dialed in 180 is the amount, 0.8 radius, and 1 is the threshold. Sometimes, however, we want to fine-tune those settings to get the result that we want, and in this case, that sharpening isn't enough. The first slider is actually quite simple, amount. This is the amount of sharpening that you're asking Capture One to apply when it finds an edge or a contrast point. We can quite often use this slider in isolation to add definition to an image, just like here, where that one slider alone delivers a similar result to using structure on the lion's fur. That's pretty good, and that's just one slider in sharpening. But in other images, it's not quite that simple. So let's flip back to our light trails on the bridge. Remember that the way that Capture One effectively sharpens is by darkening the dark side of a contrast line and lightening the lighter side of it. It results in some enhanced contrast that effectively looks sharper to our eyes when we zoom out. Now, if I push our sharpening tool to a high enough value, let me just get to 200% so you can see it properly. There. We can actually see it happen before our eyes. So let's go to our sharpening tool here and look at this edge of this lamppost. With our sharpening tool down low, we don't see any edge here that's identified with any of those halo effects. But if I push it all the way up, we can see what it's done. It's darkened the left-hand side of the line on the right-hand side of the lamppost and lightened the outside of the lamppost to make it look more defined. As I zoom out, that has the effect of sharpness. But when I zoom in and look really closely, unfortunately, we end up with these unwanted effects on the sides. So the next slider, which is radius, actually determines how far we're going to allow Capture One to add those contrast changes away from the line. The lower the radius, the less obvious that enhancement has happened will appear, but also the less of an effect the end result's going to have on the image. The higher the radius, the further out from the line we allow Capture One to do that sharpening technique, but unfortunately then the bigger the halo, the more obvious it becomes that you've over-sharpened something. So the radius has to be played with to get the best possible effect without having too much of an unwanted sign either side of that line. And then we have threshold. So threshold goes from 0 to 12, and it's basically how much contrast Capture One needs to see at an edge before it's going to even apply any sharpening. So a lower threshold means less obvious edges and lines are going to be sharpened, and potentially any noise in the image too, so be aware of that. And a higher threshold, you might accidentally exclude some of the details you wanted to enhance in the first place. In this case, if we put it up to 12, it's not going to touch anything for sharpening at all. So it's a balancing act. And it's between the amount of sharpening to apply, how wide the radius can be to have the desired effect at each edge, and the threshold that part of the image has to hit before it's even enhanced at all. And I have to say, over the years, I've always found that there really was no magic bullet as such for sharpening. I'd always end up with a halo of some form or other, and there's a trade-off for the sharpening amount that I wanted to dial in. So if I wanted to increase the sharpening amount here, give it a little bit of radius and a low threshold, I would end up with some form of halo around that lamppost. But again, a few versions ago, Capture One introduced a wonderful tool, a new tool called the Halo Suppression slider. And it does exactly what it says on the slider. Using this scale, we can effectively remove the halos that our sharpening choices have introduced. Now, as with all things, if you push it too far, you'll potentially find some unwanted side effects. But use to the minimum level possible to get your planned result, it can be an image saver. So again, in this case, let's just do without the halo suppression, and we can see these lines on the outside of the lamppost, and with the halo suppression, it's cleaned it up. It's still sharp, but it doesn't have those halos to the left and right that are a telltale giveaway that you've used a sharpening tool to get the image a little bit sharper. Now, also bear in mind that halo suppression does not work on clarity and structure halos. So it only works on a sharpening halo around an edge or a line. It doesn't work on halos that affect a texture or detail or an area in clarity and structure. So now you might see why the sharpening tool can feel a little bit more powerful as you get more familiar with it. All in all, each of the three tools, so clarity, structure and sharpening, they all need to be used to the absolute minimum amount possible to get the effect that you want. That's how we maintain a natural, real looking image. And genuinely, with all three of these tools, less really is more. I can't hammer that in enough. Subtlety is key to this stuff. Please use the minimum amount you can get away with to keep your image looking natural, but dynamic, and make sure that it pops as well. Now, equally, we can use these tools on portraits as well. We're not just limited to landscapes, so let's choose this guy here. Now, with subjects with great skin, if we go to our clarity tool, a boost of clarity can really enhance the drama in a shot. It's absolutely fantastic on certain images. Now, for older subjects, so let's pick on this old woman, so street photography as well. So street photography, older subjects, anyone with texture or grit or anything like that about their face or in the buildings and so on, both clarity and structure can really bring out the textures in those people and their surroundings. They're really powerful tools, especially when it comes to making a street photograph look more gritty. But when we say less is more, for some subjects, we can actually take it even further with negative clarity and structure. So unlike with this lady here on the street, with a portrait like this, we can actually use negative clarity and structure to smooth skin if we want. So effectively, by masking the area, let me just show you the mask that we've built here. And let's just zoom in here so you can see. So with that mask applied, by using these sliders to a negative number, we can actually have the effect of smoothing the skin in the portrait and reducing the amount of texture and detail that comes across in 1 or 2 simple clicks. Now again, less is more, don't overdo it. We don't want skin looking plastic, but absolutely this can be used not just on portraits, but it also applies to landscapes. So let's head back to our ice block here. And let's think about this for a second, because if you remember up here in the sky, we've got a load of bands and everything up here and so on. So while the addition of clarity made the sea and sky pop, it also created an uneven tone to the sky around the sun. So what if we mask that sky and put in, well, let's say I did mask it, and let's put in 100% negative clarity instead. Much better. So do you see the difference? In the same way that it can work with skin, it can also work on a landscape shot as well. It smooths out banding, it smooths out noise, it can get rid of unwanted variations in large areas in your shots, and this applies to sky as well as water and so on. So if any of you want to experiment further with any of these tools, I've actually put a link in the description to a little fun drawing here that we've actually got on top of all of this. It's a TIFF file, it's a flattened TIFF file. You can download it and have a play. In this file, you're going to find a masked layer for each tool. So we've got one for clarity, one for structure, and one for sharpening. And on each layer, you can actually dial in a different approach and a different method in this case. And you'll be able to see the literal effect that each of those tools has on a relatively safe test card. It goes from a bright white area to a dark area to a pure mid-tone at 128. So let's take halo suppression, for example. Let's just zoom in again to 100% or 200% in this case. So here's our sharpening layer. And if I go to my sharpening tool with this line loaded in, and I put my halo suppression up, we're going to see that halo suppression happens without losing sharpness. So there's before, there's after. But without halo suppression, we'd see the obvious signs of a sharpening tool. With halo suppression, they're pretty much gone. Or let's look at what the punch tool in clarity has done. So let's absolutely consider the fact that it's blown out some of these things. So these lighter areas here, we knew that it was going to do that because of the amount of contrast it adds in. But also let's just look at the color that it's brought in again. So not only has it made this uneven, and it's because at this border here, the gray area has been told to get lighter because it's lighter than its neighbor. At this border here, the gray area has been told to get darker because it's darker than its neighbor. It's the same grey area, it's the same colour from top to bottom. So Capture One has had to effectively apply a gradient across this block, and this is actually a form of a huge halo that you're seeing here, and this is one of the complications that you get with overdoing clarity. But what you're also seeing here in this test diagram is the effect of a punch method of the edges here. And what it's done is effectively it's looked at, and if you think about the colour wheel, it's looked at the blue next to it and it said, well, how do I get opposite to blue? Well, effectively, I've got to go yellow. That's the opposite to blue on the colour wheel. And that's why it's introduced that strange tint into our solid mid-grey panel. So download the TIFF file and have a play with it yourself. See what each one really does when it's pushed in all the sliders, both positive and negatively. Now, hopefully that all makes at least a bit more sense of these 3 really powerful tools for your editing. As a golden rule, if you want to increase the contrast between areas and overall presence of an image, then clarity is your go-to tool. If you want to enhance the sharpness and contrast in the detail and texture of your image, then structure should be the slider that you're reaching for. If, however, you want complete control over the details and sharpness of the finer edges and the lines in your shot with a much more granular level of adjustment, then that's exactly what the sharpening tool was designed to do. Most importantly, when used together to their own strengths, the 3 become a fantastic collection of adjustments that will genuinely make your images pop in a real and natural way.